The House on Royal Street. Delphine LaLaurie, The Fire of 1834, and the Crime New Orleans Couldn't Contain. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. The House on Royal Street, Fact, Folklore, and the Ethics of Witness. There are stories New Orleans tells the way other cities tell weather, like something that returns in cycles, inevitable, half-believed, and still capable of changing the shape of a person's day. In the French Quarter, a single house has become a kind of dark landmark. It is spoken of in lowered voices and performed for crowds. It is framed as haunted, cursed, monstrous, an attraction wrapped in ivy and rumor. Tour guides gesture toward balconies. Visitors crane their necks. The story travels easily because it contains everything the modern mind has been trained to seek: an elegant woman, a beautiful city, a private cruelty so extreme it bends the imagination. But beneath the tourism, beneath the folklore, beneath the sensational retellings that have multiplied over nearly 2 centuries, there is a hard historical core. Enslaved people were held and harmed within that home. Their suffering was real. Their pain was not a metaphor, not a Gothic embellishment, not a ghost story meant for thrills. This book is not an attempt to decorate tragedy with atmosphere. It is an attempt to look directly at what can be known, and to clearly mark what cannot. The name most often spoken in connection with the house is Marie Delphine McCarty LaLaurie, remembered today as Madame LaLaurie. She was born into one of the most influential families in colonial New Orleans, married into power more than once, and lived as a respected woman of society. Her life moved within the rooms where polite people gathered and measured each other by linen, genealogy, and reputation. And yet, on a spring day in April 1834, a fire at her residence exposed a hidden reality that shocked even a city built on slavery. The public reaction was immediate and violent. The home was attacked. The city surged toward the site as if to witness the truth with its own eyes. LaLaurie fled. Everything after that, every dramatic detail repeated with certainty, every exact number of victims, every elaborate rumor of torture chambers and grotesque experiments, belongs to the next phase of the story: what happened when horror met human fascination, and fascination met commerce. The difficulty in writing about LaLaurie is not that the story lacks terror. It is that the terror has been used. Over time, the facts have been amplified, exaggerated, embellished, and in some cases sensationalized beyond recognition. The victims are often reduced to props in a tale about an evil woman and a haunted house, while the larger truth, the machinery of slavery that made such cruelty possible, becomes background scenery. This book takes a different approach. How this book is built. This manuscript draws from historical scholarship and from early written accounts that describe the 1834 events and their aftermath. Where possible, it favors information closest to the period. It also uses later 19th century writers cautiously, noting when their work blends reporting with moral storytelling or literary style. And it treats 20th century folklore and modern entertainment, including ghost tour culture, as what they are, part of the legend that formed after the facts. A crucial distinction runs through these pages. Documented history, what contemporary sources and careful scholarship support. Reported history, what later writers claimed, often based on earlier newspapers, sometimes filtered through memory and moral narrative. Folklore, what becomes true through repetition rather than evidence. You will see those lines clearly marked. On explicit detail. This book will describe cruelty and injury, explicitly but respectfully, because sanitizing violence committed against enslaved people is itself a kind of distortion. But the goal is never gore. It is context, accuracy, and witness. A warning then, these chapters contain descriptions of human suffering that may be disturbing, including confinement, injury, and abuse. What this story is truly about. LaLaurie's story is often framed as a single monstrous figure. That framing is seductive because it allows distance, a villain you can point to, a house you can blame, a demon you can isolate. But the deeper horror of this story is not that one woman was capable of cruelty. It is that a society was structured to allow it, quietly, politely, and for a very long time. This book begins long before the fire. It begins in the world that raised her. Chapter 1. A city that learned to look away, New Orleans, 1787. New Orleans was a city that belonged to empires before it belonged to itself. In the year 1787, when Marie Delphine McCarty was born, the city was part of Spanish Louisiana, though its streets still breathed in French. People moved through markets and courtyards speaking a mix of languages: French, Spanish, African tongues, and the Creole blend that belonged to the place alone. The city did not grow gently. It grew urgently, as a port, as a crossroads, as a place where money moved quickly and bodies moved without consent. There were places in the world where slavery was hidden behind distance, plantations far from the eyes of polite society, violence absorbed by fields and forests. New Orleans was not one of those places. Here, slavery sat beside civilization. It built the houses. It carried the water. It cooked the food that appeared at dinners where people discussed opera and politics. Enslaved labor did not exist out there. It existed in kitchens, stables, courtyards, and bedrooms. The city's elegance was inseparable from the suffering that sustained it. And so from the beginning, New Orleans developed a particular kind of moral skill: the ability to keep atrocity close and still call oneself refined. Delphine was born into a family that embodied that refinement. The McCarty family was not merely comfortable. They were established, woven into the city's power. They belonged to the class that held property, held influence, held names that lasted. In New Orleans, where status could be as fragile as a rumor, the McCartys were not fragile. Delphine's parents were Chevalier Louis Barthélemy McCarty and Marie-Jean Larrable, or Larrable, figures of a world that valued lineage and connection as currency. Delphine's extended family included men whose careers would touch military command and civic leadership, names that would echo in records and histories long after the city's flags changed again. To be born a McCarty daughter was to be born into expectation. From infancy, her life would have been shaped by the rules of her class: what to wear, how to speak, how to move, how to be seen. For elite daughters, education often meant training in religion, in language, in music, in the social customs that made a woman valuable in marriage markets that were also political markets. The goal was not independence. The goal was advantage. In that world, marriage was not a romance. It was an alliance, an agreement between families, a way to increase security, expand property, and protect status in a city where fortunes could shift with fire, disease, or political change. Delphine would become very good at marriage. But she also belonged to a society that operated on contradiction. The same people who insisted on virtue and etiquette participated in a system built on the forced labor and terror of others. Children absorbed those contradictions early. They learned which forms of suffering were worth acknowledging and which were meant to remain invisible. They learned what could be said aloud and what could only be whispered. New Orleans was full of whispers. It had always been a city where rumors traveled fast, because it was small enough for reputations to circulate like currency. A name could rise or fall on the smallest scandal. Yet some scandals never fully landed. Some truths were too expensive to confront. And when wealth and family protected a person, the community learned to soften its gaze. The McCartys did not simply live in New Orleans. They helped define it. If Delphine had a childhood home filled with comfort, that comfort would have relied on invisible work, servants and enslaved people, labor that kept fabrics clean, meals hot, floors polished, and children tended. That labor was constant, and for those who benefited from it, it could become as unremarkable as air. The danger of such a system is not only what it does to the enslaved, but what it teaches the enslavers. It teaches them that power is natural. It teaches them that control is normal. It teaches them that other lives exist for use. Delphine's later story would be told as if it erupted from nowhere, as if a single person's monstrous acts were an anomaly in an otherwise civilized world. But when historians look closely at cases like hers, the beginning is rarely sudden. The beginning is a culture. It is the way a city organizes its wealth. It is the way a family organizes its authority. It is what a child learns is permitted, and what she learns will be excused. In 1787, New Orleans was already a city skilled in excusing itself. Delphine's life, like the city's, would pass through regimes and revolutions. Louisiana would change hands again. Governments would rise and fall. Laws would shift. But the foundations of power, property, status, the ownership of human beings, would remain stable enough for an elite woman to believe she was untouchable. This is how stories like hers begin. Not with violence, but with certainty. Not with screams, but with silence. Not with a fire, but with a life built inside a system that taught people day after day how to look away. Chapter 2. Delphine McCarty, Beauty, Bloodlines, and the Architecture of Status. If New Orleans was a city built on contradictions, its elite families were the ones who learned to live inside them without flinching. The McCartys did not simply occupy space in the colony, they occupied influence. They belonged to the class who could walk into the right rooms without being announced, whose names carried the weight of both history and expectation. In a place where empires changed flags and borders shifted with treaties, families like the McCartys formed a kind of continuity. They were stable where governments were not. For a daughter born into that stability, life was shaped early by the invisible structure of class: what she would be allowed, what she would be forgiven, what would be denied to her, and what would be quietly provided. Marie Delphine McCarty entered the world in 1787, under Spanish rule, in a city still distinctly French in its manners and customs. Her father, Chevalier Louis Barthélemy McCarty, belonged to the kind of lineage that translated easily into authority. Her mother, Marie-Jean Larrabel, moved within the same world of names and networks, one that valued family alliances as both protection and strategy. In a society like this, a girl's future was rarely a mystery. It was designed. The girls of elite households were raised to represent more than themselves. They represented their family's reputation. Their bodies carried an unspoken purpose: to be married well, to reinforce the family's standing, to merge influence with influence. Their manners were not simply manners, they were tools. Their education was not simply knowledge, it was training. It is difficult to reconstruct Delphine's childhood with the intimacy we might wish for, because the documents that survive from this world are rarely interested in the inner life of women, unless those women caused a disruption. But the shape of her early life can still be traced through the expectations of her class, and through what we know of New Orleans society at the turn of the 19th century. A girl in Delphine's position would have been instructed in religion and social propriety, and likely taught to read and write well enough to manage household correspondence, accounts, and the routines of a large home. She would have absorbed language as naturally as breath: French first, Spanish as the language of governance, and later English as American control approached. She would have been guided in the skills that made a woman seem accomplished: music, needlework, formal hosting, the controlled grace of a body taught never to appear hurried or uncertain. Even a girl's silence was practiced. There was also the other education, one that ran underneath polite instruction. Delphine would have grown up surrounded by enslaved labor. In elite homes, enslaved people were not a separate workforce hidden away at plantations, they were visible in daily life. They served meals. They cleaned. They cared for children. They managed the heat of kitchens, the smell of laundry, the endless labor required to maintain the appearance of ease. For the wealthy, that ease was the point. A child raised in this system did not need to be told she held power. She watched it unfold. She watched adults give orders that could not be refused. She watched people move quickly and quietly to avoid punishment. She saw work that never ended and gratitude that was expected. She learned which lives were protected by law and which lives were treated as property within it. The city itself reinforced those lessons. New Orleans was wealthy by necessity. It was a port, a hub of commerce and human movement. It was also a place where class performed itself constantly. Status was expressed in architecture, clothing, food, lineage, parties, and public behavior. People watched each other. Women especially were watched, though not in the same way as men. A man's reputation could survive certain sins. A woman's reputation was a tighter cage, but also a powerful currency. To be a woman of good standing was to be shielded by it. Delphine grew into that shield. There is little in the surviving public record to suggest she was seen as unstable, strange, or threatening in her youth. If anything, later descriptions that circulate around her emphasize exactly the opposite: she was attractive, well-connected, and socially capable. She belonged in the drawing rooms. That matters, because the LaLaurie story is often told as if it hinges on abnormality, an evil woman set apart from her time. But Delphine's early life suggests something more unsettling. She moved through society not as an outcast, but as a success. Her first marriage came when she was still very young, which was not unusual for elite daughters. In June 1800, at St. Louis Cathedral, she married Don Ramón de López y Angulo, a Spanish official described in later accounts as holding significant administrative rank. Marriage at 13 can read as shocking now, but in that world, it was a transaction accepted as normal, even admirable, if it strengthened family ties and secured status. It is here that we begin to see a pattern that will run through Delphine's adult life: alliance, advancement, public respectability. With her first husband, Delphine was folded into the world of colonial administration. It was a marriage of position. It offered proximity to power, and it confirmed her as a woman whose life would not be small. The marriage did not last long. Ramon de López y Angulo died only a few years later, reportedly in Havana. The detail often repeated is that Delphine was pregnant at the time, and that she returned to New Orleans a young widow, carrying a child. Widowhood in her position was not only grief, it was transformation. In a society shaped by patriarchal law, being a wife could limit a woman's legal control over property. Widowhood, paradoxically, could open doors. A widow could hold assets, manage households, and move through society with a distinct kind of authority, especially if she remained respectable, especially if her family supported her, especially if her reputation held. Delphine's reputation held. She did what women of her class were trained to do: she survived the disruption without falling out of favor. Her family name did not become tarnished by scandal. She remained part of the social world. She was not ruined by tragedy, she was repositioned by it. In the early 1800s, New Orleans was already shifting. Spain's control would soon yield to France briefly, then to the United States after the Louisiana Purchase. Culture did not change as quickly as political authority, but the city's social landscape was becoming more complex. New money began to collide with old families. Anglo-American influence grew. Wealth continued to expand, especially for those who knew how to navigate commerce. For an elite widow, the city offered both risk and opportunity. Delphine remarried in 1808. Her second husband, Jean Blanc, is consistently described as a prominent figure in New Orleans business and civic life, associated with finance, law, and politics depending on the source. This marriage anchored her into the world of merchants and property, the kind of wealth that was less about inherited name and more about expansion. The union produced children. It also produced stability and, most importantly, accumulation. This is where the story begins to develop its deeper texture. Delphine LaLaurie's later crimes are inseparable from the fact that she was not simply a married woman living in a house. She became, through marriage and circumstance, a woman whose life was stacked with advantage: family connections, public respectability, and the financial reach to acquire property. The city rewarded that kind of woman. It trusted her. It protected her. It assumed by default that the violence inherent in slavery could be managed properly inside the private sphere of an elite household. That assumption is one of the most dangerous things in the LaLaurie story. Because the private sphere is where cruelty thrives. In public, the city could perform morality. In public, people could condemn what was too obvious to ignore. But behind doors, behind the architecture of wealth, the law was softer, the gaze was lighter, and reputation often functioned like immunity. Delphine's early life was not a prelude of madness. It was a prelude of control. She was trained in the culture of status. She learned that a woman could gain power through marriage. She learned that tragedy could be absorbed and recast. She learned, above all, that the right name could cushion a fall. And yet New Orleans was not entirely blind. Even in the early years, whispers about cruelty and abuse sometimes circulated around elite households. These whispers rarely produced consequences. They rarely even produced documentation. But they existed, floating through the same social currents that carried gossip about affairs and finances. If Delphine heard such whispers, she would have heard them as a member of the class that benefited from their silence. Chapter 3. Widowhood, Wealth, and the Making of Madame LaLaurie. By the time Delphine McCarty became a widow for the second time, she had learned something that women of her class learned early and well: grief could be endured, and disruption could be managed, if one's position was protected by money, family, and an unbroken public face. Jean Blanc died in 1816. The details of his death do not dominate the historical memory the way the fire of 1834 does, but his absence mattered. Blanc had been a man of business and civic standing, a figure linked in later summaries to finance and law, the kind of man whose name carried weight in records as well as in drawing rooms. To be his wife meant access. To be his widow meant something else entirely. In the early 19th century, widowhood was both vulnerability and leverage. The laws of the time varied and shifted under different regimes, but the social pattern remained consistent. A married woman's identity and assets were often legally folded into her husband's authority. a widow, particularly a widow from a respected family, could become a more independent operator than she had been as a wife. The romantic version of history sometimes paints widows as tragic figures dressed in black, waiting quietly for life to end. But the real widow of wealth was frequently a manager, an administrator, a gatekeeper of assets and reputation. Delphine had children. She had responsibilities. She also had an education in the most important skill of her class, appearing composed while negotiating power. New Orleans itself was in a period of transformation. The Louisiana Purchase had brought the city under American control in 1803, but cultural change did not arrive like a clean new flag. The city's French and Spanish influences remained strong. Creole families guarded their status. Anglo-American newcomers brought different legal assumptions, different commercial rhythms, and different social expectations. It was not a gentle transition. It produced tension between old families and new money, between Catholic customs and Protestant influence, between French-speaking elites and English-speaking merchants, between the world Delphine had been born into and the world that was arriving. For many in the Creole elite, the strategy was adaptation without surrender. Learn the new order enough to keep your advantage, but preserve the old prestige. Delphine, by all accounts, was positioned to do precisely that. She had the kind of name that still opened doors. She had family connections that anchored her. And through marriage and inheritance, she had increasing access to assets. Property and wealth were not merely comforts. In New Orleans they were armor. They allowed a person to survive scandal. They allowed one's errors to be negotiated privately rather than punished publicly. They allowed one to purchase silence if silence was needed, or to outlast outrage until the city found a new distraction. This is not to suggest that Delphine's life was a straight line from wealth to atrocity. It is to suggest that she moved through a world where wealth did not merely provide luxury. It provided protection. And protection changes what a person believes they can do. After Blanc's death, Delphine remained a woman of standing. She did not disappear. She did not retreat into the margins. In the social economy of New Orleans, she was still valuable, a widow of position, still young enough to be courted, still central enough to be watched. At the same time, her household would have grown. Children required space, staff, stability. A wealthy home did not function without labor, and labor in this city was overwhelmingly coerced. Enslaved people formed the invisible machinery of domestic life. Their presence made comfort possible. Their vulnerability made control absolute. This domestic world is vital to understand, because in cases like LaLaurie's, horror does not erupt in public first. It develops in private, where the rhythms of the household become a law unto themselves. For an elite woman, the household was her domain. It was one of the few spheres where she could exercise authority freely, especially over those considered property. She managed schedules, discipline, food, clothing, and order. She supervised work and, often, punishment. She could present herself as graceful in public and harsh in private, with minimal risk that anyone outside the walls would question her methods. Even in societies that formalized cruelty, reputation still mattered. An elite household was expected to appear controlled. Enslaved people were expected to appear compliant. The city, in turn, expected not to be confronted with the mess of what made that compliance possible. New Orleans was a place of performances. A drawing room could be immaculate while a back room held suffering. A woman could host guests with steady hands while another human being trembled unseen nearby. Wealth made such compartmentalization not only possible but normal. Delphine's story begins to narrow toward its famous center in the 1820s, when she married for the third time. Her third husband was Dr. Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie, a physician considerably younger than she was. In June 1825, the marriage took place, and with it Delphine's public identity shifted into the name that would become infamous. Madame LaLaurie. The marriage itself is often noted for its age difference, but the more important detail is what it signaled socially. Delphine remained a desirable match, a woman whose combination of lineage and wealth could still draw a husband of professional standing. It reinforced her position. Her name did not fall. It held. Around this period, Delphine acquired the property that would later become the center of the scandal, a house at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter. This was not merely a residence. It was a statement. Royal Street was not a back lane. It was a corridor of status, an address that placed her firmly in the heart of an elite city. The house itself was substantial enough to hold not only family and guests, but also the labor force required to maintain such a household. A home like this functioned as a small world, complete with its own hierarchy. At the top was the mistress of the house. Beneath her were her children and relatives, her husband, her social circle. Then came the layers of labor, some paid, many not, some free, many enslaved. In a system built on slavery, the boundary between household order and human violence could be thin. The mistress of such a house could be admired for her hosting, her taste, her calm authority. She could be praised for her refinement. She could be seen from the outside as the picture of respectability. And still, behind closed doors, she could do almost anything. This is where the LaLaurie story begins to acquire its most disturbing shape. Because the surviving accounts and later reporting do not describe her as a woman spiraling into public chaos. They describe her as a woman maintaining composure while cruelty deepened in private. The horror is not theatrical. It is bureaucratic. It is domestic. It belongs to the household routines that permit abuse to continue day after day, contained behind architecture and privilege. That containment is part of why the fire of 1834 detonated so violently in the public imagination. It was not simply that cruelty existed, cruelty was already embedded in the city's structure. It was that the cruelty allegedly practiced within LaLaurie's home was described as extreme even by the standards of a society accustomed to violence against enslaved people. And it was that the evidence was revealed not through a legal investigation, not through testimony in a court, but through accident, a fire that forced doors open. Before that moment, the city could keep looking away. The system depended on looking away. Rumors may have circulated. Some accounts suggest complaints existed, that there were whispers of harshness, that LaLaurie's treatment of enslaved people was not entirely unknown to those nearby. But whispers are not accountability, and in New Orleans, where reputation and class formed a kind of protective shield, whispers often remained exactly that. The Royal Street house stood as a polished shell. Delphine stood as a social figure. The city continued its parties, its commerce, its daily movement. It is tempting, when approaching a case like this, to search for a single psychological moment where a person became monstrous. But history often refuses that simplicity. People do not always change in visible ways. Sometimes they simply become more certain that they will not be stopped. In the years leading up to 1834, Delphine LaLaurie's life appears, from the street, intact. She married well. She lived in a prestigious part of the city. She hosted. She moved through society. And inside her household, human beings were trapped in a structure designed to deny them safety, personhood, and voice. That is the tension that makes the next chapter inevitable. Because when a city's wealth is built on violence, the only true surprise is when the violence can no longer be contained. Chapter 4. The Royal Street House, Respectability as a Mask. A city can contain almost anything, so long as it remains behind the right doors. In the French Quarter, architecture does more than shelter bodies. It performs status. It tells the street who belongs inside and who does not. Wrought iron, shuttered windows, thick walls that hold back heat and sound, these are not merely practical features. They are boundaries between public life and private rule. By the early 1830s, Delphine LaLaurie's home at 1140 Royal Street was the sort of address that made people adjust their posture as they approached it. This was not a remote plantation house where cruelty could be dismissed as out there. This was the center of town, the heart of old New Orleans, where society watched itself relentlessly. The house itself has been described, in later writing, as grand and imposing. Whether seen in its original form or through the changes that time and renovation have brought, the essential fact remains it functioned as a wealthy household, and wealthy households in New Orleans were complex operations. They required labor. In the 19th century city, that labor came from enslaved people who did not have the option to leave when the work became unbearable. Domestic slavery in New Orleans was often spoken of differently from plantation labor, as though being in the house offered protection. In reality, it often created a different kind of exposure. Enslaved people within a private home lived closer to the personal whims of their owners. They were within reach, always visible, always accountable, always subject to discipline carried out in secrecy. For a mistress of the house, control could become intimate. A home like LaLaurie's operated on a daily rhythm that the outside world rarely questioned. Meals had to be prepared. Laundry had to be done. Floors had to be scrubbed. Children had to be dressed and instructed. Guests had to be received with elegance. The routines of the household were a form of performance, proof that the mistress was competent, refined, and worthy of her social position. It is important to understand how much power a woman like Delphine LaLaurie could hold in this setting. While men dominated public institutions, the household remained a domain where women could exercise significant authority. A wealthy woman might manage budgets, oversee staff, dictate schedules, and decide punishment. She might maintain a public persona of gentle civility while privately enforcing brutal discipline. And because the household was considered private, outsiders rarely intervened. Even when they knew something was wrong, there was a deep reluctance to challenge an elite woman's domestic governance. That reluctance was stronger still when the people being harmed were enslaved. Enslaved individuals were not protected by the law in the way free citizens were. Their ability to complain was almost non-existent. Their testimony, when recorded at all, was filtered through those who held power over them. The system was designed to preserve the owner's authority. Any discomfort in the wider community was often resolved through quiet warnings rather than consequences. This creates a particular kind of cruelty, the cruelty that does not need to rush. It can repeat. It can escalate. It can become habitual. The LaLaurie story has survived so strongly because it sits precisely at the intersection of two things: a city skilled in maintaining appearances, and a household where appearances were said to conceal extreme violence. The Royal Street House was not merely a building, it was a stage set for respectability. A woman like Delphine could host visitors under chandeliers while, elsewhere in the same structure, human beings lived in terror. New Orleans did not need to be told how to live with such contradictions. It had been practicing for generations. Even so, whispers gathered around the LaLaurie household. In later accounts, LaLaurie's cruelty is sometimes described as being known in vague ways before 1834. Stories circulate of neighbors noticing something off: movements in the windows, sounds, the abrupt disappearance of enslaved people who had been seen previously. These stories are difficult to verify in detail, and the responsible approach is to treat them as part of the reported layer of the narrative rather than the documented core. But their persistence matters, because they reveal what people believed after the fact, that the cruelty was not completely invisible, it was simply tolerated. There were also broader social realities that made intervention rare. First, the city's elite protected its own. Even if someone disapproved of an individual's behavior, they often preferred to handle it quietly rather than invite scandal that might spread. A public accusation could ricochet through families, business partnerships, and social alliances. Silence preserved stability. Second, the institution of slavery itself normalized violence. Even when cruelty reached a point that made others uneasy, it existed within a system that permitted coercion. Many white citizens could condemn excessive brutality and still defend the system that made brutality possible. This moral splitting was common: disapproval of a particular act without rejection of the underlying structure. Third, the people suffering had limited visibility in public narrative. Enslaved individuals were not granted the dignity of full personhood by the dominant culture. Their lives could disappear without documentation. Their injuries could be dismissed. Their deaths could be explained away. In a society that treated human beings as property, the loss of that property could be interpreted primarily as a financial matter rather than a moral one. This is why the Royal Street House is so important as a symbol. It demonstrates how close horror can sit to respectability without being disturbed, until an event breaks the containment. What happens in 1834 will be treated by many later retellings as a sudden unveiling, as though the city had been entirely shocked from innocence. That is too generous to the city. It is more accurate to say that the fire forced New Orleans to look at something it had spent years learning not to see. The Royal Street House held more than a family. It held a set of assumptions. That a wealthy woman was inherently respectable. That what occurred behind closed doors was not the city's business. That enslaved people were vulnerable by design. That reputation mattered more than rumor. That the private world of the elite could contain its own ugliness without consequences. These assumptions created a sealed environment, perfect for sustained abuse. In the story's later versions, the house becomes almost supernatural, as though evil seeped into the walls. In truth, the house did what many houses do: it reflected the power of the person who ruled within it. If terrible acts occurred there, they occurred because the structure of society allowed them to remain private. And yet, private cruelty rarely remains private forever. There is always a weak point, a witness, an accident, a moment when control slips. In LaLaurie's case, that moment arrived not through justice, but through disaster. The element that would expose her household was the oldest and most indifferent of forces, fire. Chapter 5. Smoke over Royal Street. In New Orleans, fire was not an abstract fear. It was a familiar threat, one that hovered at the edge of daily life in a city built from timber, warmed by open flame, and pressed close with bodies and commerce. Kitchens were dangerous places. So were hearths. So were the candles that burned in bedrooms and parlors and hallways long after the sun had dropped behind the river. In the French Quarter, where houses stood shoulder to shoulder and alleys funneled wind, one careless spark could turn an entire block into a furnace. The residents of Royal Street knew this. They lived with it the way they lived with heat and disease, as an accepted risk, managed through routine rather than panic. That is why, on the morning of April 10, 1834, the first signs of smoke did not at once signal catastrophe. Smoke in a city like this could mean a cooking fire, a pot tipped over, a chimney that needed cleaning. It could mean nothing at all. Until it didn't. Accounts of the fire begin in the kitchen area. In many retellings, an enslaved cook is described as the origin point of the blaze, whether through accident, desperation, or an act of resistance. The detail appears repeatedly in later summaries, but like much of the case, it must be handled carefully. The enslaved were often turned into narrative devices in white reporting, their motives assumed rather than recorded. What is more secure than motive is the sequence of events that followed. A fire broke out at the LaLaurie residence, and the response to it became the first crack in a carefully constructed surface. Once flames were visible, the city did what it always did. People ran towards the danger. Neighbors shouted. Someone summoned the fire brigade. In the Quarter, emergencies were communal by force. There was no such thing as private disaster when buildings shared walls and courtyards. When fire crews arrived at 1140 Royal Street, they came prepared for the usual task: contain the blaze, rescue those inside, prevent spread to nearby homes. What they encountered at first was not unusual for the city: a large house, a sense of urgency, a household in motion. Then the house resisted. According to the most commonly repeated descriptions, responders found themselves confronted with locked doors and refusal. In some versions of the story, Madame LaLaurie herself is said to have refused to provide keys, or to have attempted to control where rescuers could go. Whether through explicit refusal, delay, or obstruction, the effect was the same: fire responders could not immediately access all parts of the building. In a fire, seconds matter. In a fire, locked doors are suspicious. It is one thing for a homeowner to panic. It is another to impede rescue efforts when others may be trapped. That hesitation, whatever its exact form, became the first moment in which the LaLaurie household's private control collided with public necessity. Outside, smoke grew thicker. Heat pressed outward from the building. Fire crews moved with urgency, seeking access points, forcing entry where needed. People gathered, first as neighbors anxious about the spread, then as onlookers pulled by the spectacle. The French Quarter fed on news the way the river fed the port. A crowd could form quickly, and it did. There are stories, repeated across many versions, that the enslaved cook who was found in the kitchen claimed she had set the fire deliberately as an attempt to end her own suffering, fearing punishment or imprisonment. Some retellings frame her as chained to the stove. Others describe her as old, desperate, and already brutalized by years of labor. The emotional weight of this figure has made her central in later tellings. But what matters most for the documented spine of the narrative is not the exact condition of the cook, but the fact that the fire forced a confrontation between the house's private world and the city's public response. Rescuers were there for the fire. They were not there for an investigation. And yet, in many retellings, the moment a locked or barred space was breached, the purpose of the emergency shifted. Firemen moved beyond the kitchen and the most accessible areas and into spaces the household had tried to keep sealed. What they found transformed the event from a domestic disaster into a scandal that would tear through New Orleans. The discovery is often described in stock terms. Accounts that trace back to 19th century reporting describe enslaved people confined in an upper area of the house, in a state suggesting prolonged abuse, shackled, injured, and kept in conditions that horrified those who saw them. The imagery in later retellings becomes increasingly elaborate, but the central fact remains consistent: individuals were found whose bodies and circumstances indicated brutal treatment. It was the kind of sight that halted routine. Even in a society built on slavery, there were thresholds. There were levels of cruelty that people preferred not to witness. There were lines that, when crossed visibly, triggered shock not because the culture rejected violence, but because it rejected being confronted by its most extreme forms. Fire has a way of removing the curtain. As victims were brought out, or as witnesses described what they saw, word moved faster than the flames. The crowd outside swelled. People pressed close to the house, less concerned now with the danger of fire than with the possibility of seeing proof of something they had only heard in whispers. This is a bleak, revealing aspect of human behavior. Outrage and curiosity often arrive together. The scene on Royal Street became chaotic. Firemen continued their work, but the emergency had expanded. It was no longer simply a matter of saving a building, it was a matter of what the building had contained. In the versions of the story that rely on early reporting, the victims' injuries were severe enough to provoke immediate condemnation. The descriptions are not presented in delicate language. They are presented as evidence, proof of cruelty, proof of suffering. They were the kind of details that could not be dismissed as rumor once the bodies were visible. The city had been trained to look away. Now it was looking directly. As the morning unfolded, the focus of the crowd shifted from fire to blame. The question was no longer only how the fire started, but what it had exposed. The people gathered outside the LaLaurie home were not neutral observers. New Orleans was a city of loyalties and resentments. Some would have felt moral outrage. Others would have felt the anger of long-held suspicion confirmed. Others still might have been driven by a more personal fury, the instinctive, visceral response to witnessing suffering. Whatever the mix of motives, the result was the same. The crowd turned on the house. Later accounts describe the property being attacked and damaged by the public. The idea of a mob is not difficult to imagine in this setting. Fire already draws crowds. Scandal draws them faster. And when an elite household was believed to have committed acts that even a slaveholding society found excessive, the city's anger became a kind of force. Behind the walls, Delphine LaLaurie's world was collapsing. In the public imagination, this moment has become almost cinematic. Smoke rolling down Royal Street, iron balconies silhouetted against flame, the city surging towards the source like a single organism. But the true horror of the scene lies not in its drama, but in its meaning. A private system of control had been ruptured. The house had been breached not by justice, but by accident. And once breached, the city could not return to pretending it did not know. Delphine LaLaurie had spent a lifetime building the armor of respectability, lineage, marriages, wealth, reputation. Now, in the harsh light of fire and smoke, that armor began to fail. The question that remains, and that the next chapter will follow, is not merely what was found inside the house, but what the city did with that knowledge. How outrage formed, how quickly it escalated, and how a woman of such standing managed, somehow, to escape the consequences that seemed inevitable in that moment. Because the fire revealed cruelty. But revelation is not the same thing as justice. Chapter 6. What the fire revealed. The problem with truth, once it is visible, is that it refuses to stay contained. In the hours after the fire began at 1140 Royal Street, the city did what it always did when confronted with catastrophe. It gathered. It pressed in. It demanded to see. In New Orleans, spectacle and community were intertwined. A crisis in one household could become a public event within minutes, because the quarter was dense and the people were accustomed to moving towards commotion rather than away from it. But this was not just a fire. It was an exposure. What was discovered inside the LaLaurie home has been repeated so often that it now exists in layers: the documented core, the reported extensions, the folklore accretions that hardened into fact through repetition. To write responsibly about LaLaurie means stepping carefully through those layers. It means acknowledging, without flinching, the cruelty that early sources describe, while refusing to inflate it for dramatic effect. It means centering the fact that the individuals found were not characters in a Gothic tale, but human beings whose lives had already been stripped of protection long before anyone forced a door open. Here is what the historical spine of the story supports. Enslaved people were found inside the residence in conditions that strongly suggested prolonged imprisonment and brutal mistreatment. They were restrained. They were injured. They appeared to have been kept in an upper portion of the building, in a space not meant for rescue or comfort. Even in a society accustomed to violence against enslaved people, the scene was described as shocking. That matters. It does not absolve the society that allowed slavery, it implicates it. A culture built on cruelty can still be startled when cruelty becomes too visible, too unmistakable, too close to the surface. The early reporting that later writers rely on, particularly what is often traced back to local newspapers, describes several victims discovered in a miserable state, suffering from injuries consistent with torture and neglect. Some accounts specify that they were chained or otherwise restrained, and that their bodies showed signs of severe abuse. The exact details of those injuries are where the story becomes most vulnerable to exaggeration. In later retellings, the descriptions grow more graphic and more elaborate, sometimes leaning into imagery that resembles horror fiction more than historical reporting. But even the restrained version is devastating. What is essential and defensible is this: the victim's suffering was not incidental. It was not an accident of discipline gone wrong. It appeared sustained, organized, repeated. This is the point at which the LaLaurie story shifts from scandal to something deeper, a confrontation with the private machinery of domination inside an elite home. The city's response suggests that what people saw, or believed they saw, could not be shrugged off as a household matter. The victims were removed from the house. They were seen, not by one or two rescuers, but by an expanding circle of witnesses. Later accounts describe the public being allowed, or forcing itself, into proximity with the injured individuals. It is said that large numbers of residents came to view them, as though compelled to confirm with their own eyes what the rumor mill would otherwise distort. This public viewing is one of the most unsettling details of the case, because it reveals a kind of collective hunger, outrage, yes, but also a morbid fascination. People wanted proof. They wanted the story to become concrete. They wanted a moment that could be pointed to and said, "Here. This happened. This is real." And the victims, already stripped of dignity by enslavement, were again treated as evidence, bodies made public, suffering made spectacle. The cruelty was theirs. The narrative was not. For LaLaurie herself, the discovery represented collapse. Reputation is a fragile thing, and yet it often survives scandal if the scandal remains ambiguous. What happened on Royal Street was not ambiguous. The injured were visible. The fire had forced entry. The city had the details it craved. The situation was no longer manageable through whispers and private warnings. It was now a public accusation made of flesh. Accounts describe the crowd outside the LaLaurie residence growing agitated, then enraged. The anger did not remain abstract. The house itself became the target. In later summaries, the property is described as being damaged or sacked by the crowd, a kind of spontaneous public punishment when formal justice seemed uncertain or slow. This, too, sits inside contradiction. The same city that benefited from slavery now attacked the home of a wealthy enslaver as though it were punishing an aberration. It is tempting to read this as moral awakening. It is more accurate to read it as boundary enforcement. LaLaurie was perceived to have crossed a line that made the community feel stained by association. In other words, the outrage was not only for the victims. It was also for the city's self-image. There is a reason LaLaurie's name has endured when countless other enslavers' names have faded. Her story provided New Orleans with a villain who was safe to condemn. A wealthy woman whose cruelty could be labeled exceptional. A monster who allowed ordinary people, including those complicit in slavery, to claim distance. And yet the cruelty described within her home could never have occurred without the system that placed human beings entirely under her control. The violence was not supernatural. It was enabled. The fire, then, did more than expose a household secret. It exposed the weakness in the city's moral performance. It forced New Orleans to face a question it had avoided for generations: what is happening inside the private spaces of power? For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the answer might produce consequences. This is the moment that readers often assume leads directly to arrest, trial, punishment. That assumption comes from modern expectations. Wrongdoing exposed equals accountability. But New Orleans in 1834 did not operate on modern expectations. Justice was not impartial. Status mattered. Money mattered. And the lives of enslaved people mattered least of all in the formal systems designed to protect those with property. Even as the city raged outside her door, Delphine LaLaurie possessed something many did not: a network. She had family. She had connections. She had a reputation that, though cracking, had not yet been replaced by official conviction. She had the practical resources to move quickly when necessary. And she did. The most chilling question of the LaLaurie story is not whether cruelty occurred. The convergence of early reporting and consistent retellings makes it clear that severe harm was discovered. The chilling question is this: how did she get out? How, in the middle of a public scandal so intense the crowd tore at her home, did Delphine LaLaurie escape the city? The answer, like so much else, lies in the architecture of privilege. It lies in the way doors open more easily for some than for others. It lies in the quiet assistance that power can summon, even when public opinion turns violent. Chapter 7. The Crowd, the Ruins, and the Escape. The fire at 1140 Royal Street did not simply reveal violence. It revealed a breach in the city's agreement with itself. For years, perhaps longer, New Orleans had lived beside cruelty without demanding to see it. The institution of slavery required exactly that, a collective ability to normalize the suffering of others, to keep it background, to treat it as a private arrangement between owners and the owned. But the moment Delphine LaLaurie's household was opened by force and fire, the suffering was no longer abstract. It was visible, undeniable, and uncontainable. And once a city is forced to witness what it has been trained to ignore, it reacts with a kind of volatile intensity, part moral shock, part fear of contamination, part appetite for punishment. The gathering outside the LaLaurie home was no longer a crowd of neighbors concerned about property damage. It became something sharper, a public that felt personally affronted. People in slaveholding societies often maintained a line between what was acceptable and what was too much, not because they rejected the structure of slavery, but because they wished to believe there were limits. The LaLaurie discovery was perceived, by those who saw it, and by those who heard the early descriptions, as a violation of those limits. That is one reason the response turned physical so quickly. Accounts of the aftermath repeatedly describe the house being attacked by the public. It is said that furnishings were destroyed, property damaged, and the interior of the home torn apart as though the city itself attempted to rip out what had been hidden there. Even allowing for later exaggeration, the consistency of this element across retellings points to a real and forceful public assault on the property. The destruction of the house was, in a sense, symbolic punishment. It was a way for New Orleans to declare, "This is not us. We will not allow this under our name." But symbolism is not justice. Crowds can destroy a building in hours. Courts can take years, and in a system that privileges wealth and status, courts can take forever. In the immediate chaos, official response was complicated. New Orleans did not have modern policing structures. Authority was fragmented across institutions, and the legal protections afforded to enslaved people were minimal, inconsistently applied, and often subordinated to the rights of property owners. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of any attempt to narrate LaLaurie's case. Even if the city was outraged, the legal system was not designed to protect the victims. What then could be done? There were, at least in theory, laws and civic expectations that could be invoked against extreme cruelty. But in practice, these mechanisms were weak. Complaints could be ignored. Investigations could be softened. Punishments could be negotiated. And the higher a person stood socially, the more likely the consequences would be diluted into inconvenience rather than destruction. Delphine LaLaurie stood very high. By the time the crowd was tearing at her home, she had already lived decades within the protective shell of lineage and money. Her family name connected her to the old elite. Her marriages connected her to both colonial administration and commercial power. Her very presence in society had trained others to assume her respectability. Even as that respectability cracked, the habits of deference did not vanish instantly. Powerful people rarely fall as quickly as the public hopes they will. Somewhere in the midst of the chaos, while the crowd surged and the house burned and the story raced through the quarter, Delphine LaLaurie escaped. This is the moment many readers find hardest to accept, because it feels like the narrative should change shape here. The revelation has occurred, the villain should now be captured, order should be restored. Instead, the opposite happens. The woman at the center of public fury disappears. Exactly how she fled is one of the details that becomes increasingly theatrical in later retellings. Some accounts mention a carriage. Others claim she slipped away under protection. Some insist she was spirited out of the city with help. What is consistent, however, is the broad outcome. LaLaurie left New Orleans and evaded immediate punishment. This is not unusual in the history of power. When an elite person is threatened, they often possess the resources to vanish, and the network to make vanishing possible. Escape is not only a matter of distance. It is a matter of assistance. To leave the city swiftly in the 1830s required logistics, transport, money, planning, and the ability to move without being detained. It required friends or allies willing to facilitate the departure, whether out of loyalty, shared interest, or fear of their own association with scandal. It also required the failure, or unwillingness, of authorities to stop her. There is something starkly instructive in that failure. The public response was loud enough to tear a house apart, yet not effective enough to keep its owner from leaving. This alone reveals the limits of outrage within a society structured to protect the privileged. While LaLaurie escaped, the victims remained. They remained injured. They remained exposed. They remained, in many ways, without legal personhood. Their suffering had been made visible, but visibility did not automatically translate into care or protection. The city's attention, once intense, could move on quickly. A scandal burns hot and then cools. The victims continue living with the aftermath long after the crowd disperses. And yet, for a brief window, it is said that the victims became a focal point for public sympathy. People came to see them. They expressed horror. They condemned LaLaurie. The question is what that sympathy could accomplish in a city where sympathy was not backed by structural change. This is where the narrative becomes morally complex. New Orleans, outraged by LaLaurie, still benefited from the system that made LaLaurie possible. The same households that condemned her still owned enslaved people. The same public that tore at her furniture still lived in houses built and maintained by coerced labor. The condemnation may have been sincere, but it did not threaten the foundations of slavery itself. In cases like this, society often seeks a single scapegoat, someone whose monstrosity can be isolated, allowing everyone else to keep the larger system intact. LaLaurie served that purpose perfectly. A wealthy woman who could be labeled exceptional. A household whose horrors could be treated as unique. A villain who allowed the city to define itself against her, without being forced to confront its own complicity. And so the destruction of the Royal Street home became a kind of cleansing ritual. Tear apart the visible symbol of evil, and the city can reassure itself it has done something meaningful. But the meaning was limited. LaLaurie was gone. What remained was a damaged house, a set of traumatized human beings, and a community struggling to process what it had been forced to see. And because LaLaurie escaped, her story could not conclude in the usual way. It could not close with a sentence, a punishment, a neat moral ending. Instead, it remained open, and open stories are the ones that become legends. The absence of closure creates a vacuum, and vacuums fill with invention. Within days, rumors would expand. Details would sharpen into certainties. Numbers would grow. Motives would be assigned. The house would become more than a house. Delphine LaLaurie would become more than a woman. In the decades that followed, the story would be retold so many times that the boundary between record and myth would blur. But before the myth fully formed, there was the matter of the official aftermath, what the city attempted to do once the smoke cleared, how the law responded, and what was written down, if anything, about consequences. Chapter 8. Accountability, such as it was. When the smoke thinned over Royal Street, New Orleans faced an uncomfortable question. Not the question tourists ask now, whether the house is haunted, whether evil lingers in the bricks, but a far more immediate and practical one. What, exactly, was the city prepared to do about a wealthy woman accused of extraordinary cruelty? Outrage is not a legal category. It has no binding power. It can shatter windows and topple furniture, but it cannot by itself compel a court to act, or force a person of status into a cell. In the days after the fire, the LaLaurie case moved from the chaos of the street into the slower, more calculated domain of civic response. This transition matters because it reveals the machinery of the era, who was protected, who was heard, and how quickly the public desire for consequences could be softened into procedural hesitation. The central obstacle was embedded in the structure of slavery itself. Enslaved people were not treated as full persons under the law. Their suffering could be described, pitted, even condemned, and still be filtered through legal systems designed primarily to protect property rights. The state's interest in the well-being of enslaved people was often less about morality and more about social order, public scandal, and the maintenance of an image that slavery could be managed without descending into obvious barbarity. This is the tragic irony of much of the 19th century record. Certain forms of cruelty were publicly condemned because they embarrassed the system, not because the system valued the victims. Even so, there were legal and civic mechanisms that could, in theory, be used against an enslaver deemed excessively brutal. Authorities could investigate. Enslaved people could be removed from a household. Owners could be fined. In rare cases, charges could be pursued. But these mechanisms were inconsistent and dependent on enforcement, and enforcement depended on political will. Delphine LaLaurie's position made her difficult to confront. Her family connections were not a minor detail, they were a shield. In a small society like New Orleans, where the elite were bound together by marriage, commerce, and mutual dependency, a scandal involving a prominent woman threatened to spread. Many who might have condemned her privately would have preferred, practically, to contain the damage. That tendency to contain is one of the reasons her escape was possible. The same networks that elevated her could also protect her from the full force of the public's rage. Official consequences, when described in later summaries of the case, are often framed in limited terms. Her enslaved people were removed from her control and sold, her household disrupted, her property damaged. The question is whether these outcomes were punishment or simply rearrangement within the same system. If enslaved people were removed, they were still treated as property to be sold. If a fine was levied, it could function as an inconvenience rather than a ruin. And if LaLaurie herself remained beyond reach, either through flight or protection, then the official response could not satisfy the public's demand for accountability. It is also important to recognize that records from this period are incomplete and shaped by bias. The kind of detailed court transcripts modern readers expect do not always exist, and when they do, they are filtered through the perspectives of those in power. LaLaurie's victims are largely nameless in the surviving public narrative. Their voices do not appear unmediated. Their lives, already controlled in the most intimate ways, were also controlled in the way the story was recorded. In practical terms, what the city could do was limited by the fact that LaLaurie was gone. If she had remained and been arrested, the case might have moved through formal channels more visibly. But the absence of the central figure undermined momentum. Legal processes require a body to punish. The city had bodies, the injured victims, but not the body of the woman accused of harming them. And so the story drifted into a familiar 19th century pattern: scandal, response, partial consequence, and then a kind of enforced forgetting. New Orleans was accustomed to this rhythm. The city could erupt into fury and then return gradually to business. The river kept moving. The market kept opening. The social calendar kept turning. Outrage could burn hot, but it could also become exhausting. People had children to feed, debts to pay, a world to maintain. In such a climate, the absence of closure becomes fertile ground for mythology. Because without a trial, without a sentence, without a neatly recorded end, the story could not settle. It remained suspended, open enough to invite repetition, interpretation, and embellishment. The lack of formal justice created a narrative gap, and the human mind fills gaps with invention. This is why, within a few years and certainly within decades, LaLaurie's story began to swell beyond what could be carefully documented. Her name became a shorthand for something the city did not want to acknowledge too directly: the extremes of cruelty that slavery could permit, especially within private homes. Writers later in the 19th century began to retell the story, often drawing on earlier newspaper accounts while adding moral framing or Gothic weight. These retellings helped cement the LaLaurie narrative into the city's cultural memory. They also introduced a new risk: each retelling, even when rooted in truth, could be reshaped by the needs of the storyteller, to horrify, to entertain, to sell. But before the legend fully took hold, there was still the immediate aftermath for those who had been harmed. The victims' lives did not end with the fire. Even if some were removed from LaLaurie's household, removal did not mean freedom. It meant transfer. It meant that the people whose suffering had shocked the city could be absorbed back into the same structure that enabled their suffering in the first place. It is here that the moral center of the case becomes clearest. A society can condemn a person and still preserve the system that person used. New Orleans could rage against Delphine LaLaurie and still remain a slaveholding city. It could destroy her home and still rely on enslaved labor to maintain its own. It could point to her as a monster and still refuse to look too closely at the everyday violence that surrounded it. In that sense, accountability was not only incomplete, it was shaped to protect the larger social order. And perhaps that is why LaLaurie's story remains so compelling. It is not only a tale of an individual's cruelty. It is a case study in how power operates when confronted with its own reflection. The fire forced the city to see. The aftermath allowed it to look away again, not fully, not cleanly, but enough to keep the system intact. And so Delphine LaLaurie passed from scandal into something more enduring: a symbol, a legend, a horror story told in the voice of a city that could not quite admit the truth of what it had built. Chapter 9. Exile and the Unknowable End. The most unsettling villains are not always the ones who face justice. Sometimes they simply vanish. In the LaLaurie story, the escape is not an aside, it is one of the narrative's defining features. If Delphine LaLaurie had been arrested, tried, and publicly punished, her story might have remained a scandal of its era, remembered locally perhaps, but ultimately contained by a legal ending. Instead, she slipped out of New Orleans, and that absence created a kind of narrative vacuum. The city was left with outrage and ruins, but no formal resolution. An unresolved story is a story that grows. After 1834, Delphine LaLaurie's trail becomes difficult to follow with certainty. This is not unusual. 19th-century records are fragmentary, and when a person intentionally withdraws from public life, documentation thins. Travel across oceans did not produce the paper trails modern readers expect. Names shifted spelling. Women's movements were often recorded through husbands, relatives, or property transactions rather than through their own agency. But the broad arc that emerges from repeated accounts is consistent. LaLaurie left Louisiana and traveled to France. The details vary in the telling. Some sources describe her leaving quickly under cover of chaos, moving through the region before departing the country. Others imply she was helped. Some suggest that her family connections were instrumental. What can be responsibly stated is that she did not remain to face the full weight of public fury in New Orleans, and that she was later associated with France, where she appears to have lived in some form of exile. This raises an uncomfortable point that is essential to the historical tone of this manuscript. Exile is not the same thing as punishment. For an enslaved person, there was no exile, only confinement, sale, transfer, pain. For a wealthy woman, exile could mean a change of scenery. It could mean moving into a quieter life supported by remaining assets and family assistance. It could mean, in practical terms, survival. The degree to which LaLaurie retained wealth after her flight is difficult to reconstruct fully from public summaries. Her property on Royal Street was damaged. Her reputation in New Orleans was destroyed. But wealth does not always evaporate with scandal. It can be redistributed, sheltered, passed through family channels, kept intact by networks that outlast public anger. If she reached France, she reached a world where the scandal of New Orleans could be distanced, softened, and eventually replaced by other interests. And yet, even in France, her story did not die. It continued to be told, and over time it continued to mutate. One of the reasons it is difficult to pin down her later life is that her identity was no longer defined by daily public appearances or civic records. In New Orleans she had been visible, a hostess, a widow, a wife, a property owner, a woman with a social role. In exile, she became something else, a person whose notoriety might follow her, but whose movements were not necessarily recorded with clarity. A few key points recur in the historical and semi-historical retellings. That she lived in France after fleeing New Orleans. That she died there at some point in the mid-19th century. That her death is reported with varying dates and circumstances. This variance is not merely an inconvenience for the historian, it is part of the reason the myth flourishes. When records are thin, imagination fills in what the archive does not provide. Some accounts describe her death as ordinary. Others add drama, a fatal accident, a fall, a violent end. These later flourishes have the feel of narrative justice. If the courts did not punish her, the story itself must. It must provide an ending that satisfies the human desire for consequence. But the historian's task is not to provide satisfaction. It is to differentiate between what we can support and what is merely preferred. A plausible and often repeated claim is that LaLaurie died in France around the late 1840s. A date frequently cited in later summaries is 1849, though without uniform documentation. Some references also note a tombstone bearing her name in New Orleans, suggesting her remains may have been returned or memorialized there, but such claims too should be treated with care unless supported by specific archival citation. What matters for our purposes is not only the date of her death, but the effect of the uncertainty. Because LaLaurie's unclear ending did something powerful to her story. It kept her alive in the imagination. When an offender escapes clear punishment, they remain threatening. Their story never fully resolves. They become a figure who can be summoned whenever people want to tell a story about hidden evil, about the corruption of wealth, about the darkness that can exist behind respectable doors. Delphine LaLaurie, as a character in New Orleans memory, did not need to remain physically present to remain culturally present. In fact, her absence may have been her greatest fuel. The city could not stop her, therefore, the city could not stop talking about her. This is where the LaLaurie narrative begins to tilt from history into legend. The original scandal is still the foundation, but the structure built upon it grows taller with each retelling. The house on Royal Street becomes more than a location. It becomes a vessel, a symbol, a container for everything the city wishes to name and separate from itself. A physical place where horror can be located and therefore controlled, as though evil is something that lives in a building rather than a system. As the years passed, writers returned to the LaLaurie story again and again. Some did so with moral intent, using it as proof that slavery corrupted those who practiced it. Some did so to entertain, leaning into Gothic details to shock their audience. Some did so because the city itself demanded it. New Orleans has always been a place that makes stories out of itself, turning history into myth until the two are inseparable. By the late 19th century, the LaLaurie tale was already becoming what it would remain, a narrative with a historical core and a folkloric skin. What happened inside that house in 1834 was real enough to horrify an entire city. But what the story became afterwards, the numbers, the inventions, the supernatural gloss, was shaped by a cultural need. It was shaped by the desire to turn a crime into a morality play, and then into a spectacle. And so LaLaurie's exile is not simply an absence. It is a beginning. It marks the moment when the story's factual record thins and the myth-making accelerates. Chapter 10. From Scandal to Legend. New Orleans has never been a city that lets a story die quietly. It is a place where history is not simply recorded, but performed, repeated until the retelling becomes part of the landscape. In such a city, a scandal does not remain a scandal. It becomes a tale, then a warning, then an entertainment. It becomes a thing people say they know, even when the details shift from mouth to mouth like river water. The LaLaurie case was almost destined for this transformation. It contained the elements that myths thrive on: a grand house, an elegant woman, a hidden horror, and crucially, an ending that refused closure. Delphine LaLaurie fled. The victims were seen, then absorbed back into a system that offered them no lasting protection. The house was damaged. The city erupted, then moved on. The legal consequences remained unclear. The villain vanished into another continent. That unresolved shape made the story fertile ground for invention. In the immediate years after 1834, the account existed largely as scandal and memory, a thing locals spoke about, a reminder of an event that had briefly cracked the city's surface. But as time passed, the story began to migrate into written narrative. Once that happened, it was no longer only an event people remembered, it became a story people consumed. And consumption changes a thing. Later 19th century writers played an important role in fixing LaLaurie in public imagination. They were often writing in an era that loved moral storytelling, tales that proved a point about sin, cruelty, and consequence. Some writers were abolitionist in tone, using LaLaurie as an example of the corruption inherent in slavery. Others were drawn to the Gothic appeal, the macabre contrast between refinement and brutality. The key shift in these retellings is not simply that they repeated the facts, but that they shaped them. They selected certain details. They intensified others. They smoothed out the uncertain parts. They transformed a chaotic historical moment into a narrative with themes and momentum. This is the beginning of the LaLaurie legend, the point where the case stops being merely an historical incident and becomes a symbol. One of the most influential patterns in later writing is the gradual escalation of detail. The earliest accounts describe enslaved people discovered in shocking condition. Later writers amplify the horror, sometimes adding elements not present in the earliest descriptions. Increased numbers of victims, more elaborate descriptions of injuries, rumors of hidden chambers and grotesque practices. The story becomes less about what can be proven and more about what can be imagined. This is not unusual. Horror always expands when retold. But in a case like LaLaurie's, the expansion carries ethical weight. It can turn real suffering into a form of entertainment. It can reduce the victims to a set of images designed to shock, rather than people whose lives mattered beyond the moment of discovery. The legend also offered the city a kind of narrative convenience. By framing LaLaurie as uniquely monstrous, New Orleans could condemn her without interrogating itself. It could point to her house as a singular site of evil and treat it as an anomaly. A city built on enslaved labor could reassure itself by saying, this was not normal, this was an exception, this was one woman, one house. In that way, the legend protected the wider system from scrutiny. It allowed the city to keep its hands clean in the story it told about itself. But the legend did more than that. It shifted the case from social history into something closer to folklore. The house itself became increasingly central. Over time, the LaLaurie residence turned into a physical anchor for myth, a place people could point to, visit, and fear. In a city already rich in supernatural tradition, it was not difficult for the story to acquire hauntings. Hauntings are how communities express what they cannot reconcile. When a society cannot deliver justice, it sometimes turns to the supernatural as a substitute. Ghosts become moral accountants. Curses become narrative punishment. The idea that the house was haunted allowed people to imagine that some form of consequence still existed, if not in law, then in spirit. This transformation was accelerated by the way New Orleans sold itself. Long before modern tourism, the city understood the power of its own mystique. It cultivated romance, decadence, and danger. By the 20th century, ghost tours and popular histories had become an industry. Stories like LaLaurie's were perfect for that industry, horrifying, dramatic, tied to a physical address, and endlessly adaptable. Here, the case reaches another turning point, the commodification of cruelty. As the story entered tourism and popular culture, it became more stylized. It became more cinematic. It became less tethered to careful sourcing. Each new version borrowed from older versions and added new flourishes to keep audiences hooked. The narrative became more victims, more gore, more secret rooms, more dramatic escapes. This is how folklore works. It optimizes for impact. But what folklore gains in impact, it often loses in truth. By the time the LaLaurie story became a staple of ghost tours and entertainment, it had fused with other cultural currents. The Gothic fascination with decadent women, the trope of the mad mistress, the voyeuristic thrill of hidden depravity, the desire to believe evil is rare and concentrated rather than systemic. The result is a modern LaLaurie myth that often feels like a horror film, a beautiful villain, an elaborate torture chamber, a haunted house. It is worth pausing here to say something plainly. The real history does not need embellishment. The brutality of slavery, even in its ordinary forms, is already extreme. The idea of human beings imprisoned, injured, and restrained within an elite home in the heart of New Orleans is horrifying enough. To make it bigger and more grotesque is not only unnecessary, it can become a distortion that serves modern appetites rather than historical witness. This is where the responsible true crime writer must be careful. Your role is not to strip away atmosphere. Atmosphere is part of how readers understand a world. But your role is also not to amplify suffering into spectacle. The balance lies in clarity, presenting what can be supported, acknowledging what is contested, and tracing how the story evolved so the reader can see the difference. To do that, we have to return to sources. We must ask, which details appear in accounts closest to 1834? Which appear in later 19th century moral retellings? Which appear only in 20th century folklore and tourism narratives? Which details serve narrative appetite more than historical evidence? These questions do not dilute the horror. They deepen it. They reveal not only what happened, but how societies process what happened, how they turn trauma into story, and story into commodity. Chapter 11. Myth and Record, a Clear Accounting. The LaLaurie story has been told so often that it now exists as two things at once. It is a historical event rooted in a specific date, a specific house, and a documented public scandal. And it is a legend, layered with additions, exaggerations, and supernatural framing that grew over time until the myth sometimes replaces the record entirely. To write about LaLaurie with integrity, we have to hold both realities in view. We have to understand why the story grew, how it was shaped by retellings, and where the boundary lies between what can be responsibly stated and what should be labeled as uncertain or folkloric. This chapter is an accounting. It does not exist to drain the story of atmosphere, but to protect it from distortion. A narrative can be both compelling and accurate. In fact, accuracy often makes the horror more profound, because it places it where it belongs, in human choices and social systems, not in Gothic invention. What follows is not simply a list, but a layered map of the LaLaurie narrative, what is most firmly supported, what appears consistently but remains harder to verify in full detail, what is contested, and what belongs to folklore. The documented core, what can be stated with the most confidence. The core of the LaLaurie case is anchored by a small number of points that remain consistent across credible historical summaries and early reporting. Delphine LaLaurie, born Marie Delphine McCarty, was a prominent, wealthy New Orleans woman. In April 1834, a fire occurred at her Royal Street residence. During the response to that fire, enslaved people were discovered in circumstances suggesting severe abuse and confinement. The discovery provoked public outrage. The property was damaged by a crowd. LaLaurie fled New Orleans. These points form the story's foundation. They do not require sensational additions to be horrifying. A wealthy woman, in a respected part of the city, allegedly maintaining a private regime of cruelty so extreme it shocked a slaveholding public, that is already a devastating narrative. This core can be presented as the spine of the manuscript without qualifiers beyond careful phrasing that recognizes the limitations of 19th-century documentation. The reported layer, consistent claims that appear frequently, but require cautious language. Beyond the core, there are details that appear repeatedly and plausibly, often traced back to early newspapers and 19th-century retellings. These are the details readers commonly encounter, and many may be true in substance even when the specifics are uncertain. These include the enslaved cook and the origin of the fire. Many versions of the story identify the fire's origin as the kitchen, and describe an enslaved cook as being involved, sometimes framing her as having set the fire deliberately out of desperation. This detail appears widely, but the cook's exact condition and motive are difficult to confirm with certainty from surviving public summaries. The responsible approach is to present the claim as reported and to avoid definitive statements about motive. Refusal or delay in providing keys. A frequently repeated element is that rescuers were initially prevented from accessing certain parts of the house, whether through refusal to provide keys, obstruction, or delay. The consistency of this claim across retellings suggests it reflects something real in the events unfolding, but the exact dialogue and responsibility can shift depending on the source. It can be treated as a strong reported detail, described without theatrical quotation. The number of victims found. Many accounts refer to a specific number of individuals found imprisoned and injured. This number is often repeated as 7, though variations exist. Because numbers are among the most vulnerable details in historical retellings, especially in a sensational case, it is best to present the reported figure while acknowledging that exact counts can vary between sources. Public viewing of victims. Accounts describing large numbers of residents coming to see the victims appear often in later summaries that draw on early reporting. While precise numbers are difficult to verify, the general phenomenon, that the discovery became a public spectacle, is consistent with the social reality of the quarter and with the case's public impact. It can be included as reported, with emphasis on what it reveals about the city's relationship to suffering. LaLaurie's escape route and immediate departure. The method of her escape is often described in vivid terms: a carriage, a hurried departure, assistance from allies. The broader fact of escape is solid, the exact logistics are often embellished. This is a case where the narrative can remain strong without overstating. The simple truth is already disturbing: she fled, and the city did not stop her. These details, handled carefully, add texture without claiming what cannot be proven. The contested layer, details that may be drawn from later sources, or where the record is inconsistent. Some of the most repeated claims about LaLaurie fall into a contested space, plausible in tone, but difficult to anchor securely without stronger archival support. These include the scale of death directly attributable to her household. Many modern retellings claim high numbers of victims, sometimes suggesting dozens or even over 100 deaths. These figures are frequently repeated online and in tourism narratives, but are not consistently supported by early reporting. It is possible that more deaths occurred than were documented, as enslaved lives were not reliably recorded, but it is not responsible to state large figures as established fact. The best approach is to acknowledge the uncertainty. The historical record cannot easily capture the full scope of harm in a system designed to erase victims. The exact nature of injuries described in later retellings. Descriptions of injuries become increasingly extreme in later narratives, sometimes including elements that resemble medical experimentation or stylized mutilation. While early accounts describe brutal mistreatment, the more elaborate details often appear in later versions that may be influenced by moral storytelling or by the requirements of Gothic drama. Where these details are included, they should be framed explicitly as later claims rather than confirmed fact. Claims of prior legal interventions before 1834. Some accounts suggest authorities had previously removed enslaved people from LaLaurie's control or that formal complaints were made. Such claims may be rooted in real social friction, but the documentation available in general summaries is uneven. This is a case where a cautious phrasing serves the reader best, some accounts suggest, rather than it is known. Her death and burial circumstances. The claim that she died in France around 1849 is widely repeated. The claim that her remains were returned to New Orleans or that her name appears on a tomb in St. Louis Cemetery is also repeated. Without presenting a specific archival citation, these details should be written as reported rather than definitive. This contested layer is important, not because it is sensational, but because it reveals how easily a story solidifies into truth through repetition. The folklore layer, dramatic claims that are not supported by early reporting and should be labeled as legend. Finally, there is the folklore that has attached itself to LaLaurie's story, often through 20th-century ghost tour culture and horror entertainment. These include secret torture chambers described with elaborate architecture. While it is plausible that private spaces were used to confine victims, later depictions of elaborate underground chambers and purpose-built torture rooms often reflect the aesthetics of horror rather than the realities of a 19th-century urban household. Extreme mad scientist narratives. Some retellings present LaLaurie, or her physician husband, as conducting grotesque experiments. These claims tend to appear in later sensational accounts and are difficult to support as factual. They function as narrative escalation rather than documented history. High body counts stated with certainty. Folklore often inflates victim numbers to heighten shock. This is common in legendary crime stories. It should be treated carefully. It may reflect a communal sense that harm was extensive, but it is not reliable as a precise historical count. Hauntings and supernatural phenomena. Ghosts, curses, and paranormal claims are part of how the city has processed the story, but they are not evidence. They belong to cultural memory and tourism narratives, rather than historical record. To dismiss folklore entirely would be to misunderstand New Orleans. Folklore is one of the ways the city thinks. But to present folklore as fact would be a betrayal of the victim's real experience. What this accounting reveals, the ethical center of the story. A story becomes legend for a reason. LaLaurie's narrative grew because it offered something the city needed, a way to locate evil in a single person rather than in a system. By making her monstrous beyond measure, the broader cruelty of slavery could appear less monstrous by comparison. The legend allowed a slaveholding society to declare itself morally outraged without dismantling the structure that made such cruelty possible. This is why it is so important to keep the record clear. The victims were real. Their suffering was not an aesthetic. It was not a morality play. It was the lived consequence of absolute power exercised over people stripped of rights. The purpose of separating myth from record is not to soften the story. It is to strengthen it. The truth is already unbearable enough. Chapter 12. The Real Horror, Systems that Protect Monsters. A single person can commit terrible acts. That is not rare. What is rarer, and far more revealing, is a society that allows those acts to continue quietly, and then when exposed, helps the offender disappear. This is why the LaLaurie story endures. It is not only a tale of one woman's cruelty. It is a case study in what happens when power is concentrated, accountability is weak, and the victims are positioned by law and culture as people who do not fully count. It shows us how evil can live comfortably inside respectable systems, fed by ordinary structures, property law, social networks, household privacy, and the moral flexibility required to preserve status. The legend tells us to look at Delphine LaLaurie and see a monster. The record asks us to look further. Because even if every sensational flourish were stripped away, even if the story contained only its documented core, it would still reveal a truth that is difficult to face. The violence was not an aberration in a safe society. It was the extreme edge of a society already built on violence. Slavery was not simply a practice of labor. It was a structure of domination. It gave owners nearly total control over the bodies and lives of enslaved people. It permitted punishment. It encouraged fear as a tool of management. It turned human beings into property while still expecting the appearance of moral order. In that structure, cruelty could always hide behind legitimacy. Even when communities disapproved of certain excesses, their disapproval existed within a framework that accepted the foundation, the ownership of people. This meant condemnation could be selective, shallow, and self-protective. A city could be outraged by too much, while still depending on enough violence to keep the system functioning. LaLaurie's case, as retold, is often framed as a moral rupture, a point where New Orleans recoiled from cruelty. but it is more accurate to say New Orleans recoiled from visibility. The fire forced the private into public space. It put suffering where it could not be politely ignored. It threatened the city's self-image, because it suggested that extreme cruelty could exist at the heart of elite society, behind an address that symbolized respectability. In response, the city reacted with fury. It attacked the house. It condemned LaLaurie. It performed outrage publicly and loudly. And then, crucially, it allowed the larger system to remain intact. The victims did not become free. They were not transformed into citizens with rights. Their pain did not dismantle the laws that made their pain possible. The outrage did not end slavery. It did not even fundamentally disrupt the city's dependence on enslaved labor. Instead, the outrage found a target that did not require systemic change. A woman. This is one of the reasons LaLaurie remains so compelling to modern audiences. The idea of a monstrous woman carries a specific cultural charge. It combines horror with fascination, because it violates expectations about femininity, domesticity, and care. It allows a story to be told with a twist, the hostess as torturer, the mother as predator, the domestic sphere as a crime scene. But focusing solely on gender can obscure what matters most. Delphine LaLaurie's cruelty was not possible because she was a woman. It was possible because she was an elite enslaver in a society designed to protect enslavers. Her gender shaped the way she operated, within the private sphere of the household, within the domain of domestic authority, but it did not create the power she wielded. That power came from wealth, lineage, and the legal status of human beings as property. And because she was a woman of status, the household was her empire. The private sphere is often romanticized as a refuge from public violence, but in systems of inequality, the private sphere can become an ideal site of abuse. It is shielded by walls. It is legitimized as family business. It is protected by the cultural reluctance to interfere. It is the place where control can be exercised without witnesses, and where victims are isolated from public scrutiny. The LaLaurie house, then, becomes emblematic not because it was uniquely evil, but because it demonstrated how easily an elite home could become a hidden prison. This is the part of the story that should chill the reader most. It was not a dungeon built for horror. It was a normal house in a normal street, functioning as a respectable home, and that normality created cover. When readers ask why LaLaurie could do what she did, they often search for psychological explanations: sadism, pathology, personal madness. Those explanations may exist, but they are incomplete on their own, because they imply the main factor is individual character. The main factor, historically, is opportunity. LaLaurie had opportunity because she had control. She had control because enslaved people were legally and socially positioned as vulnerable. She had control because the community treated the elite household as private territory. She had control because the law's interest in the well-being of enslaved people was weak. She had control because rumors could be ignored when the person at the center of them was protected by money and family. If she crossed a line so visible the city erupted, it does not mean the city had been morally clean until that point. It means she crossed a line that threatened the city's ability to pretend. That is why the fire changed everything. And that is also why, after the fire, the city's response remained limited. The house could be destroyed, but the person could escape. The crowd could punish furniture, but the courts could be slow. Enslaved people could be removed from her household, but removal could still mean sale and transfer, not freedom and safety. Outrage could be loud, but power could still protect itself quietly. LaLaurie's escape is not only a plot point. It is the most instructive evidence of what privilege does. In the modern imagination, the idea that a city could fail to capture a woman so publicly condemned feels almost absurd. But it aligns with what history repeatedly shows: when someone is well-connected, consequences become negotiable. That negotiability is part of the true horror, because it means the story is not only about suffering. It is about the ways suffering is managed by those who benefit from it. Once LaLaurie fled, her case became unresolved, and unresolved cases do something in public memory: they demand repetition. People keep retelling them in an attempt to produce the ending reality did not deliver. Each retelling becomes an act of narrative compensation, adding details, escalating horror, invoking ghosts, to create the sense that justice exists somewhere, even if it never existed in court. This is where folklore enters. The hauntings are not proof of supernatural evil. They are proof of human discomfort. They are the city's attempt to keep the story alive in a moral register when formal accountability failed. Ghosts serve as the punishment the law could not provide, the reminder the city could not fully bury. But folklore can also be a form of avoidance. It can make the story about spirits rather than systems. It can turn the victims into scenery. It can turn real violence into entertainment. This is why a careful accounting matters. If we treat LaLaurie as a singular monster, the story becomes safely contained. It becomes a cautionary tale with a villain. If we treat her as an expression of a broader system, the story becomes uncomfortable because it reveals the social conditions that allow monsters to thrive quietly. This is where the LaLaurie case forces the reader to confront a question that extends beyond New Orleans, beyond slavery, beyond the 19th century. What does a society protect, even when it claims to condemn? When the answer is status, property, and reputation, cruelty does not need to hide far. It only needs to hide behind the right facade. Chapter 13. The Victims, Names Lost, Lives Real. The LaLaurie story is often told as though it belongs to one woman. But the center of this case is not Delphine LaLaurie. The center is the people who suffered in her household, the enslaved individuals whose bodies carried evidence of cruelty that an entire city could not ignore once it was forced into view. In most popular retellings, these victims appear only briefly. They are discovered. They are described. They disappear again, swallowed by the narrative of the villain and the house. Their identities blur into anonymity, and the story resumes its focus on the woman whose name endured. This is one of the most painful and revealing features of historical violence. The perpetrator becomes a character, the victims become a condition. It is not only a tragedy. It is a continuation of the erasure that slavery imposed. Enslaved people were not recorded as full persons. Their births, deaths, marriages, and relationships were often documented only insofar as they affected ownership. Their names could be altered or replaced. Their histories could be lost because the society that relied on their labor did not consider their lives worthy of lasting record. When the fire exposed what had occurred inside the LaLaurie house, the victims became visible for a moment, and then the system that had made them vulnerable reasserted itself. This is why it is important to slow down here and look at what the record can tell us, and what it cannot. The first and most difficult truth is that for many of the enslaved individuals connected to the LaLaurie case, we do not have stable names. We have descriptions, sometimes numbers, sometimes a few details like age or role in the household, and sometimes nothing more than the fact of their suffering. This absence is not accidental. It is structural. It reflects a society that did not prioritize the documentation of enslaved lives, even when those lives became the center of a scandal. In the accounts that trace back to early descriptions, several victims are mentioned as being found confined and injured. Their condition was described as severe enough to provoke shock and outrage in witnesses. That fact alone tells us something about the violence. It was not subtle, not easily dismissed, not merely harsh discipline. It was the sort of sustained cruelty that a crowd considered beyond the boundaries of acceptable concealment. But what did it mean to be one of those victims? To answer that, we must consider the reality of domestic enslavement in an elite urban household. An enslaved person in a wealthy home was subject to constant proximity. Their work was not seasonal or bounded by daylight. It was personal. It involved cooking, cleaning, childcare, serving at table, dressing hair, laundering clothes, managing heat and mess and endless demands. It also involved living under intimate surveillance. The mistress of the house could observe, judge, and punish without needing intermediaries. For those who suffered extreme cruelty, the household became a trap. There was nowhere to run without risk. There was no legal right to leave. There was no guarantee that an appeal to neighbors would be believed, and even if believed, there was no guarantee of protection. The fear of punishment was not theoretical, it was daily reality. Violence could be used not only as discipline but as terror, a way to ensure compliance through ongoing threat. The record describes victims restrained and confined, suggesting that the harm involved not only physical injury but imprisonment. That imprisonment is significant. It implies a private regime of domination beyond what was visible in ordinary household labor. It implies secrecy, planning, and a willingness to isolate human beings from even the limited social oversight that domestic slavery sometimes involved. It is tempting, as a writer, to fill the gaps in the victims' lives, to imagine their names, their voices, their thoughts. But doing so risks another form of appropriation, turning real suffering into invented narrative. The ethical task is to write what can be supported while refusing to treat the victims as faceless. One way to do this is to tell the truth about what the record does. We can say, these individuals were enslaved, which means their lives were already shaped by coercion and vulnerability. We can say, they worked inside a household that performed refinement. We can say, they were found in conditions suggesting sustained brutality. We can say, their identities were not preserved in the same way the perpetrator's identity was. That last point is not a minor detail. It is central to the story's moral weight. Delphine LaLaurie's name survived because she was wealthy. Her marriages and lineage placed her firmly in recorded society. Her property was documented. Her scandal made headlines. She could not vanish from history entirely because her kind of life leaves paper behind. The victims could vanish because the system intended them to. When the victims were removed from the house, their future was uncertain. Even if the city offered sympathy, sympathy did not equal freedom. In a slave-holding society, removal could mean sale or transfer. It could mean being sent to another household. It could mean continuing to live within the same structure of forced labor and vulnerability, only under different ownership. This is the bitter reality behind many historical cruelty cases. Rescue does not necessarily liberate. If people were moved out of LaLaurie's control, they still existed within a world where their lives were controlled by others. Their wounds might have been treated, or they might have been displayed, or they might have been spoken about as evidence, but they remained trapped in a system that could recycle them into further exploitation. This is why the LaLaurie story should not be told as a tale of discovery leading to justice. It is a tale of discovery leading to scandal, and scandal leading to legend, while the victims were left to the same historical forces that had already harmed them. To write this case truthfully means resisting the temptation to treat the victims as a dramatic device. It means recognizing that their suffering is not simply what makes the story horrifying, their suffering is what makes the story real. It also means refusing to let the legend replace the lives. The most sensational versions of the LaLaurie story often increase the horror by increasing the spectacle. They describe more elaborate torments, more grotesque scenes, more supernatural consequences. In doing so, they sometimes erase the victims further by turning them into scenery in a haunted house narrative. A respectful true crime approach does the opposite. It keeps the victims at the center by acknowledging their humanity and the limitations of the record, and by framing the violence not as entertainment but as evidence of a system capable of extreme cruelty. It is also important to say clearly that the victims did not choose this story. They did not choose to be part of a scandal. They did not choose to become a legend. Their lives were forced into narrative because their suffering collided briefly with the public gaze. Our responsibility, as writers and readers, is to treat that collision with care. Conclusion. The House on Royal Street. The stories that endure are rarely the ones that end cleanly. They endure because something remains unresolved, not only in the facts, but in the human need for meaning. The LaLaurie story survives in New Orleans for that reason. It is a narrative built on exposure without justice, outrage without transformation, witness without repair. Delphine LaLaurie did not become legendary because she was the only cruel enslaver in 19th-century Louisiana. She became legendary because her cruelty was forced into public view in a way that the city could not politely ignore. It was not the existence of violence that shocked New Orleans. Violence was already woven into its economy, its households, its streets. It was the visibility of a particular kind of violence, the kind that ruptured the performance of refinement. On April 10, 1834, fire did what law and rumor had not. It opened a private domain. It forced doors and exposed bodies. It turned a wealthy woman's household into a public crime scene. And then, when the city surged with anger and demanded consequences, the woman at the center of the scandal vanished. That vanishing matters. It is the hinge of the story. It is the reason the case refused to close, and the reason it grew into myth. When a villain escapes, the narrative cannot settle into a verdict, it must seek resolution elsewhere. For New Orleans, that resolution was found in legend, in the haunted house, in the curses, in the escalating retellings that promise, at least in story form, that evil does not go unpunished. But legend is not justice. It is compensation. This is the difficult truth at the heart of LaLaurie's case. The aftermath did not repair what was done. It did not free the victims. It did not dismantle the system that made their suffering possible. It offered at best a moment of public condemnation and a partial, limited response shaped by the values of a slaveholding society. And it offered something else too, something far darker, an example of how easily a community can focus its moral outrage on a single figure while leaving the larger machinery intact. Delphine LaLaurie became a convenient monster. A wealthy city built on enslaved labor could point to her and say, "This is not us. She is the exception. She is the aberration. She is the darkness contained in one house." This is one of the reasons the myth persists so strongly. The LaLaurie story, told as a tale of singular evil, allows distance. It lets the broader culture breathe easier. It turns systemic brutality into a contained horror, a single address, a single woman, a spectacle safely fenced by time. But the record, even in its incomplete and imperfect form, asks a more uncomfortable question. What does it mean that such cruelty could exist at all within the heart of respectable society? To confront that question is to confront the reality that the LaLaurie case is not only a story about a woman. It is a story about systems, about what happens when one class of people is granted near total control over another, when household privacy becomes immunity, when social standing functions like protection, when power is inherited and defended and rarely challenged until it becomes too visible to ignore. Delphine LaLaurie's life, traced in broad outline, moves through the architecture of privilege. A daughter born into one of New Orleans' prominent families. A girl trained in the performance of refinement. A young bride folded into colonial authority. A widow, then a wife again, then a widow again, each stage increasing her autonomy and financial reach. A property owner on Royal Street, where her name and address signaled belonging and status. A hostess, a figure of society, a woman protected by networks that did not dissolve even when scandal erupted. This is not the story of a woman living on the margins. It is the story of a woman positioned in the center. And the victims, those found injured, restrained, and imprisoned within her home, were also central, though history has pushed them into the margins. Their names were not preserved the way her name was. Their inner lives were not recorded the way her dinners and marriages were. Their suffering was documented as scandal rather than as biography, and then absorbed into a system that continued to treat them as property. To name that erasure is part of ethical witness. It is to acknowledge that history often remembers perpetrators more clearly than it remembers victims, and that this imbalance is not accidental. It reflects the same power structures that allowed the abuse to occur. This is why the question of myth versus record is not a pedantic exercise. It matters because myth can become a second form of erasure. When the LaLaurie story is turned into entertainment, when it is inflated into spectacle, when it is packaged as gothic horror, when it becomes a haunted house tale, the victims risk being lost again. Their suffering becomes scenery. Their bodies become narrative props. Their reality becomes a vehicle for other people's thrill. The truth, though, is already horrifying enough. It does not need exaggeration to be devastating. It needs clarity. It needs honesty. It needs a refusal to turn human pain into a commodity. This book has attempted to offer that clarity. To tell what can be supported and to label what cannot. To place the story in its historical context without letting context soften its brutality. To treat the victims not as characters, but as people. And to acknowledge what the LaLaurie case reveals about a society that could condemn one person while preserving the structure that enabled her. New Orleans has always been a city skilled in turning history into story. That gift is part of its beauty, and part of its danger. The line between remembrance and performance can be thin. The LaLaurie case sits exactly on that line, a tale that has been retold until it sometimes feels more like a myth than an event. But the fire was real. The victims were real. The outrage was real. The escape was real. The house stood on Royal Street not as a portal for supernatural evil, but as a testament to the ordinary protections of wealth and privacy. Its legend tells us what the city fears. Its record tells us what the city permitted. In the end, Delphine LaLaurie's story does not offer the satisfaction of a clear verdict. It offers something more troubling, an image of how power behaves when confronted, and how easily a culture can return to normal after glimpsing the worst of itself. Perhaps that is why people still stop at the address and look up at the shutters. They are not only seeking a ghost story. They are seeking a boundary, a way to locate evil somewhere over there, behind a particular door, in a particular past. The harder truth is that the LaLaurie case is not an isolated darkness. It is a lesson in what human beings are capable of when a system grants them control without accountability. If there is any justice left to be made in telling this story, it is not in satisfying modern appetite for horror. It is in refusing to forget the victims, and in refusing to let the legend become a mask for the deeper crime. The house on Royal Street has been called haunted. But the most haunting part of this story is not what lingers in its rooms. It is what happened there, in the full daylight of a society that learned for far too long how to look away. Bibliography. Primary and near-primary sources, 19th century. Cable, George Washington. The Haunted House in Royal Street. Originally published late 19th century, widely reprinted. Available via Louisiana Anthology. Martineau, Harriet. Retrospect of Western Travel. London, Saunders and Otley, 1838. Available via Internet Archive and Library of Congress scans. New Orleans B. Louis/Labille de la Nouvelle Orleans. Reports on the LaLaurie Fire and Discoveries, April 1834. Niles Weekly Register. A Horrible Affair. 1834. Daily National Intelligencer, Washington, D.C. Shocking Brutality. April 1834. National Gazette and Literary Register, Philadelphia. April 1834 coverage of the LaLaurie scandal. Scholarly and credible secondary sources. Delphine LaLaurie. 64 parishes, the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Madame LaLaurie of New Orleans. JSTOR. LaLaurie, Delphine. Biographical summary and source list. Wikipedia. Later retellings/literary and cultural record. Cable, George Washington. The Haunted House in Royal Street, PDF reprints. Martineau, Harriet. Retrospect of Western Travel, Project Gutenberg edition.